Hi class, and welcome to this video, which is part of Year 12 VCE Economics, Unit 4 Outcome 1. And this is our video where we're going to continue understanding budgetary policy, but we're here going to focus on what we call the budget outcome. Specifically, what do I mean by a balanced budget, a budget that is in deficit, or a budget that is in surplus? Now, this is our second video in this outcome, and you can see that it is going to cover our third key knowledge point. So if you're wanting to have a bit of more understanding of what a budget is and budgetary policy, I recommend looking at the first video that we've done. What do I hope that you really understand out of this video? It's hopefully going to be a pretty short one. What do I mean by this budget outcome? What is a balanced budget? What is a budget in deficit? And what is a budget in surplus? Now, we're not going to go into what necessarily a government will do, how they would act on that. That is going to be on future videos. It's just going to be understanding what these terms mean, and also have a look at the Australian economy. Have we had deficits or surpluses in our history, and maybe some analysis of why that has occurred. So what do I mean by a budget? Let's just take it back. What is budgetary policy? What is a budget? A budget is just the plan of government expenditure. And a budget is going to outline all of the receipts or revenues minus all the expenditure. And that's going to equal what we call our outcome. So with every budget, there are three possible outcomes. Firstly, we could have a balanced budget. The most rare of them, this is where the total value of our receipts or revenues actually equals the value of the outlays or expenditures. So this could be, for example, a budget that has $100 billion of receipts, but also $100 billion of expenditures. So the outcome is zero. It is balanced. Now, here are some terms that we're going to talk about a little bit later in future videos. We would say that this budget is neither expansionary or contractionary because it is just balanced. Now, we're not going to talk about that one too much anymore because that very rarely happens. What often happens is a government will have either a budget deficit or a budget surplus. When I say a budget deficit, this occurs when the receipts or revenues are less, so let's just make that really clear, are less than the value of the expenses. Now, we would consider this an expansionary budget. We're going to go into that to more detail in future videos, but it's expansionary. If we think about what that means, we're trying to make something bigger, and we're trying to make the economy bigger here as there is more spending than receipts. So we're spending more than we're receiving. And remember, government spending is an important component of aggregate demand. So if governments are spending more than they're receiving, this should expand aggregate demand, increase the GDP, and increase economic activity. So to just put some numbers on this, this might be the case where the government has $100 billion of receipts, but they've decided to spend $120 billion of spending. So the outcome is negative $20 billion. So in a sense, we're expanding the economy by $20 billion more than what we would if we had a balanced budget. The other option could be a budget surplus. Now, logically, if a deficit means we have more expenses than receipts, a surplus is where the receipts or revenues are more than the value of our expenses. Now, we would consider this to be a contractionary budget. We're trying to reduce the size of the economy, reduce demand, because we're contracting something. And contracting means something smaller. And this is because there is less spending than receipts, and hence we are actually reducing aggregate demand, reducing a GDP, reducing economic activity. So this would reduce our GDP, reduce economic activity. And you might be going, why would we ever want to do that? Why would we ever want to reduce GDP, reduce activity? This is typically happens if we have high inflation or we're having to pay back some of the deficits in the past. And we'll go into that in future videos. So here could be an example where a government has $100 billion of receipts, so we're keeping that quite similar to each one, but the government only spends $80 billion of it, which means we have a positive $20 billion. So here's a little bit more information. We will go through this relatively quickly because we're going to cover this in future videos. Balanced budgets, we're not going to talk about too much. This is where the total value of receipts equals the value of expenses. This is neither expansionary nor contractionary, and it's not going to specifically impact aggregate demand or economic activity. It doesn't have a significant effect on overall levels of employment and inflation. It's essentially, another good word for this is it is neutral. The government is not taking a stance that it's trying to increase the size of the economy or decrease it. Now, if we have a deficit, the total value of the receipts is less than the value of expenses. Now, because of this, we're going to have to finance that deficit because we're going to have to find the money to spend more than what we're getting. And there's three ways to do this, and we'll talk about that in a future video. They could borrow from the overseas, borrow from the Reserve Bank, borrow from the Australian public, all viable ways to do this. The key word here being borrow. And for those of us that understand debt, when you borrow it, a downside of this is there will likely be, or not likely, almost certainly, will be interest payments that have to be made. So you can start to see why governments don't want to always do this. Now, we know a surplus is where the receipts are more than the expenses. This occurs typically when economic activity is too strong. And remember, as an economist, we're trying to make everything sustainable and flatten the highs and reduce or remove those big lows to make everything sustainable. So we're trying to, this often happens when economic activity is too strong and there's inflationary pressures. And because we have a surplus, we have more money coming in than we're spending. So what are we going to do with that money? There's three main options. They could reduce the debt. They could save it to spend it later date and maybe earn some interest along the way. Or they could add it to a special savings fund for an actual specific purpose. And we'll go through that in future videos, as I've said. Now, when we are reporting deficits and surpluses, there are a few different ways that governments might report that, a few different numbers. Headline cash outcome is going to be one that you often see. And this is just the total cash received less the total cash paid. So all the money coming in, all the receipts, minus all of the expenditures. That might seem the most logical way, but this can sometimes be a bit misleading because this can include cash flows that aren't going to directly impact the economy. There might be some big one-off items or that are going to distort that. So hence economists and the people who make the budget come up with other ways to report the outcome. And another way is underlying. And you're seeing same terms as in inflation, headline and underlying. This seeks to exclude the cash flows that are included in the outcome for headline, but aren't going to actually impact the economy or are significant one-offs. These are things like future fund earnings, investment in financial assets, sales of government businesses, purchases of shares. So these are really one-off things. Or for example, the future fund, this is excluded because it doesn't impact the economy because future fund earnings are reinvested. So we're not going to actually grow the economy because of it. Now that's quite complicated. The textbook that we are using does a good job of explaining that. Now for those of us that do accounting, and I'm an accounting teacher too, we know there's a difference between cash and profit. The fiscal outcome purely looks at the revenues and expenses, very similar to an income statement or profit and loss statement. Now, you don't have to be an expert at this, but understanding that these are different terms is important. So what has been happening in Australia? I feel like we could almost split it up into 3 sections. Like most, we are typically interested in VCE Economics of the last 2 years, which we'll put down here. And what has really happened in those 2 years? COVID. Now, I think we understand that, and you might notice it. This is where we've had the biggest budget deficits in history. Not only in absolute numbers, but almost in percentages of GDP. So ongoing budget deficits have increased because of the COVID pandemic, and this peaked with the 2021 budget, which had a deficit of 7.8% of GDP, which is a massive number when we look at it. Other than that, I feel like we can split it up into 2 other sections, because you can see about 2008, 2009, we had quite a lot of surpluses. Not massive ones, it peaked at 2% GDP. This meant we had more money coming in than going out. During this time, we had a strong economy, high GDP, and it was thought that at this time, and why did we have a strong economy? Things were going well, mainly because of things like the mining boom. Lots of money coming in due to those taxes on mining companies and royalties because of all of this. Governments, particularly the Conservative government, which typically likes to create budget surpluses, save the money and to try and reduce debt. Now, post 2008, 2009, we have had what we would say is ongoing deficits. This was largely due to, and you can see they became quite big around this time. This, I believe, was around the global financial crisis and the impacts of that. So I will put GFC here if people know what the GFC is. The globe and Australia was a part of that, even though we did better than most, was experiencing a period of quite low growth. So the governments were making a call that it was important to have budget deficits to try and expand the economy that way. Low inflation, low growth. So we'll write that here. A period where we had quite low inflation, but low growth. So governments made the call that they should try and expand the economy with budget deficits. And of course, in COVID, not much money coming in because people weren't making income, companies were not earning tax, significant expenditures due to JobKeeper and JobSeeker and all of those sorts of things meant to high budget deficits. Now, if we look at the 2022 and 2023 budget, we are predicting ongoing significant budget deficits. 134 billion in 2020-2021, 79.8 billion in 2022. Still remaining budget deficits totaling $224 billion all the way up to 2026. Now you can see that they are starting to reduce. You can see as a percentage of GDP, they're going from 6.5% down to 1.6%. Now, this is a prediction. It doesn't mean it will definitely happen. But the government, in the previous budget, this was done by the Conservative government, which was voted out in power. So this budget could change. We're predicting a reduction in the deficits as they tried to reduce the amount of debt that Australia had. Now, I hope that you found this video useful and you've left understanding what we mean by these budget outcomes and what we mean by a balanced budget, a budget in deficit, and a budget in surplus. Future videos will now start to look at how these are going to impact economies and the decisions governments have to make when they are in deficit or in surplus.